Alrighty. Excuse me, I have my wires all tangled here. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays. I'm your intrepid narrator pilot Frageth, and today we're going to read through the final portion of ManFac by Martin Caidin, he of the $6 Million Man fame. So previously on, our protagonist, Lance Parker, went to see an old college buddy named Dirk and his wife Deidre, and they caught up on old times. He's like, "Oh yeah, I was in a nuclear accident and stuff. I look like a real disaster," and they're like, "Get over here, you self-hating bum." And he's like, "Oh, okay, I guess you guys love me and will accept me even though I am a mangled cripple and stuff, and that makes me happy." And he was happy. And then he learned that nuclear material was stolen from the local university, which was supposed to be under Dirk's supervision. And he's like, "Well, how did you let that happen?" And I do know a couple guys. I may or may not be part of a private organization that can, in fact, find that nuclear material for you. And Dirk's like, "That sounds great. Um, Maybe you should do that." And Lance is like, "This is awesome. I finally have a new calling in life." And then right before we left, we got introduced to some new guy, a new character, this big burly dude named Afsar Husain, who crashes this open debate slash lecture at the university, and rants and rails largely about how the Western powers and the United States in particular um, have generally prevented any lesser developed nation from developing its own nuclear program. And then he just kind of runs off and meets, incidentally, with a couple of Middle Eastern transfer students at a bar slash diner. And they're all like, "Hey, we liked your speech, buddy." And he's like, "Don't bust my cover." Um, what does it say here? Here we go. He asks, "Why do you compromise me?" And they're like, "That's not true." And he's like, "What is not true? Did you not follow me? Did you not select that other table deliberately? Did you not come here unbidden? Listen to me, you little children. I am in this country under a Turkish passport, but the authorities know I spent 2 years in Iran, that I was in the Iranian Army Special Strike Force." Um, so he kind of makes it sound like, oh, he's an undercover agent in the U.S. So who is this guy? Well, we are about to find out. Not a whole lot left in this book. We do have a resolution coming up. It's a reasonably sizable chunk, regardless. And I am going to have a decent Ronald Reagan impression for some of this. I could probably do that. We'll see if I can do it on the spot. I will forget by the time I have to, and then failing that, because this was what, 81, so it wouldn't be Reagan, would it? I will come up with something. Y'all just have to put up with it. Anyway, um, without further ado, oh yeah, I have a slideshow of the four covers because I was like, oh well, I don't want to use one that I've already used before of the four I've got because I could only find four images, four distinct images of the book cover, um, and only two book covers for it. Sadly, I didn't look for days, but I did look for a good hour or two. Um, for ones of varying quality. So I set up a slideshow instead, which is a slightly different than what I've done before. It's a little fast, to be honest. Let me slow that down. That's actually going to be distracting. Uh, Let's swap that to like 1,000 and double that to be like 4,000. Let's see if that feels a little better. Still a bit distracting, but I'll just try to look at my audio levels. That's how I know when things have broken, is when the audio levels stop or hold steady. Thank you for tuning in, Liz Angel. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoy this somewhat dated and it's a bit pulpy. It's we have fun here. We try. Sometimes I forget some of the particular bits in a book, and I'm like, oh, that hasn't aged. That sentiment has not aged well. um, but I do some curating. Generally, if I read something and I got something out of it, I'll try and read it here. But otherwise, I try to do a little curation. Not editing in terms of changing what a book actually says. That's always going to be there. Um, I will not remove portions. I will not abridge, for better or for worse. Chapter 28. Afsar Husain drove his van slowly along the winding and heavily wooded road. He turned left at a street marked Dead End and flicked a lever concealed beneath the dash before him. An amber light glowed. He nodded with approval, eased the van forward, and turned into a driveway. He stopped before a closed garage door, waited patiently for the door to open, and then drove into the garage. He shut off the engine as the doors closed to seal off the world behind him. Lights filled the spacious garage. He went through another door into a laboratory workshop filled with electronic and mechanical equipment. Ah, it is it is Afsar Hussain himself, Lee Grazzi said, smiling. Did it work? The man with the thick black curls nodded. Like a charm. We've made the first direct contact. Faster than I expected, and frankly, that disturbs me. I better let the explanations wait, Lee broke in. Dirk and the others, including some people from the White House, are waiting to talk with us. Afsar Hussain grinned. Not with me, I dare say. She shared his amusement. No, not with you. Do you have it? I can start the processing while you get ready. Afsar nodded. He removed his clothes and slid open a panel of his rib cage. Lee studied the open space, reached in, and withdrew a microcassette. She studied it carefully. Almost fully run out. Did you get it all? Yup, every bit. Their voices, their names, an emotional gamut. Everything we need for a complete psychological profile. All right, Lance. I'll make the arrangements for the university computer first thing in the morning, but please do hurry. Do you need any help? Thanks, love. I can handle it. You go on and tell them I'll be right along. He watched her leave, waiting motionless until he heard the steel bolt. Steel bolt. Bleh. He watched her leave, waiting motionless until he heard the steel bolt close behind her. He walked up to the metal overhead trapeze they'd rigged in the workshop, hooked the holding clamps to the ManFac, went through the steps he'd learned quickly, and stepped backward slowly to emerge from the now motionless ManFac of Afsar Husain. Lance washed up and slipped into casual sports clothes and walked slowly from the workshop into the living room, where Dirk Martin and the hastily assembled group waited for him. He looked about the room, meeting the eyes and studied review of the 20 people who'd watched his approach. Gentlemen, this is Mr. Parker, Dirk said. I won't bother with introductions. Please identify yourself as you speak. It'll be much easier that way. Lance caught Deirdre's eye. Coffee? Coffee? She asked. He nodded and took a seat held for him with a table by his arm. He made certain to pick out from the group Arthur Patterson, sent by direct order of the President. Lance sipped coffee, making the wait uncomfortable. He took extra seconds to light a cigar and then directed his gaze about the room. Short and sweet, he said without preamble. Let's not have any cabinet meetings. Has anyone found anything? He finished his coffee and leaned both hands on his cane held between his knees, the cigar smoke drifting slowly away from him. The men in the room exchanged glances with one another, but the only response was a low buzz of murmured conversation. Lance locked eyes with Jack Beale, security director for the university. You, Jack, how about it? Beale didn't hide his own disappointment. Empty hands, Mr. Parker. We've been following anybody and everybody who might fit into what we're looking for. Jack, that's half the goddamn campus. How do you follow 20,000 students? The FBI's been working closely with us, Beale said, forcing some steel into his voice. They have a list of names that seem the most likely to be troublemakers, and the list is so much crap, Beale. The FBI man didn't appreciate anything about Lance Parker. But Bill Schaefer swallowed his pride and presented a fierce glare to Lance. You're talking awfully strong for a man who has only questions, Parker, he snapped. That your best style? Lance goaded him. Or are you trying to resurrect the ghost of Hoover? The last time I heard, he'd crumbled to dust. Not even enough left to turn over in his grave. Lance gestured impatiently at the FBI agent. You don't have the right names, Schaefer. That's the long and the short of it. Then why, Schaefer sneered, don't you tell us who they are? The list is being drawn up right now. It's not complete, but we have most of the key names. Lance let it hang in the air. We're preparing a cross-check of the names with organizations, biographical material, cross-references with associates, the usual statistical structuring. Then why the hell haven't we gotten that? Schaefer shouted. Because you'd rush out and arrest them and screw up the whole works, Lance said, his words stinging Schaefer. Hasn't it gotten through to you yet? It's not the people we want. It's the plutonium. Grabbing the people could lead unknown Confederates to set off a bomb. Lance turned from the FBI man to the group at large. Who's here from the AEC and DOD? Several people from the Atomic Energy Commission and 2 men from the Department of Defense raised their hands. Short and sweet, just like I asked before, if you please, gentlemen, Lance requested. Anything? Bob James from the AEC shook his head. There isn't an inch of ground we haven't covered with every radiation detector known to man, he said. I mean that quite specifically. We've had Geiger counters and ionization detectors and everything else in cars, on bicycles, on security vehicles, even in the hands and in the backpacks of 200 people who've been over every foot of the campus. And all we've got are a bunch of radioactive watches. And, he added, 2 357 Magnums used by the local police force with radioactive night sights. We've even picked up that kind of low-level radioactivity, but nothing with the signature we need. Defense? Lance asked. Gerald O'Connor looked glum. We've been working with the other groups. We thought about using the ROTC locally, but decided against it. We don't know if someone with them might be involved. Good move. Lance turned back to Jack Beale. You've done the vehicle checks? Beale nodded, grateful for the chance to say something positive. Mr. Parker, we've worked with local police, the sheriff's department, the highway patrol. We've even used public works trucks and street cleaners and everything else. We've catalogued every vehicle in this whole place big enough to handle the weight and bulk of the plutonium. We can't get a single lead. Well, Lance sighed, it would be harder to be more thorough than that. But then, Jack, I never expected you to find a thing. Beale was openly surprised. Why's that, sir? Everyone else hung on the response from Parker. Because everything points to the fact that the people who took the plutonium are well organized. They're also smart. They have discipline, and they can add 2 and 2 and come up with anticipating everything. Precisely that you've done. Why would they then leave themselves wide open to being exposed through your very predictable methods? You're all thinking on the wrong wavelength. You're looking for the criminal mind. You won't find it. Now, Lance said with emphasis, who's here from the university's maintenance section? A hand went up. Your name, please? Roger Coach. Good. I want a breakdown and schematic of all heavy power line systems, especially 220 volts and up, everywhere on this campus. Coates couldn't prevent the shrill laugh he offered in response. You must be kidding me, mister. Of yourself, I don't know which. This university is filled with research centers and laboratories and workshops and medical centers and... He stopped and studied Lance. Parker, we've got heavy power loads crisscrossing this campus in every direction. You know what it takes to run those stadiums alone? I don't know, and I don't care. I didn't ask for a sum of your burdens, Coates. I asked for schematics. You couldn't even study all those sheets in less than a month if you worked 24 hours a day. For Christ's sake, Coates, shortcut the routine. Get all your heavy power line usage from your metering systems into computer charts and graphs. Use flow data, that sort of thing. You know how to do that, don't you? Well, yes, but... Then feed everything you get into a comparator open loop line on the computer. Compare the usage for the last few days with the pattern established for the past 6 months. You can eliminate the peak loads and drops, as based on football games and other events with obvious high power output. Somewhere in that mass of raw data, something is going to stick up its pointed little head and tell us where we have totally unexpected and unprecedented power demands. We can then begin to trace it down, determine if machinery is involved. However it happens, we'll get some leads. Hard leads. There'll be lighthouses in all this darkness. Don't just sit there, man. Get the lead out. Get started right away. Do you know what the hell time it is, Parker? Yeah, I know. 60 seconds to midnight, and when the bell tolls 12, you're liable to find a mushroom growing under your feet. A kind that goes up to 40,000 feet. Jesus, get cracking. Roger Coates and an assistant stalked out. Good, thought Lance. He's pissed off, and he'll break his chops to prove me wrong. The room settled down, and Dirk Martin stood up, pacing nervously. He stopped and looked directly at Lance. Did you hear what happened tonight at the seminar in the auditorium? No, I wasn't there. No, I wasn't there, Dirk. I got back here and came right in to join you. Something special? Dirk shook his head in memory of the events. Special, all right. It was incredible, that's what it was. He grimaced. Some giant. He's listed in the school records as a Turk and an Iranian. You mean dual citizenship? Lance broke in. He saw Dirk nodding, and Lance showed contempt. And the FBI didn't know a thing about him? He glanced at Bill Schaefer. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Hoover is spinning in his grave. Dirk, forgive me. Please go on. Dirk shrugged in frustration. He has a mind like a razor. I guess seeing him standing there, bigger than life, fooled us. He was so fast he kept ahead of us and whipped the crowd along as he desired. Then some football players, the asses, lost their temper and jumped him. He broke them up like they were children. I've never seen such strength like that. Who is he? Lance pressed. Oh, that's no secret. He told us. He announced it, for God's sake. Afsar Husain. I know one thing. We've got to learn a lot more about him. Lance exchanged a casual glance with Lee Grazzi. Only they knew that Lee had paid $200 to 2 rough-and-tumble players of the Gator football team to teach that damn Turk a lesson. But right now, both men were in the hospital. Never mind him, Lance said to Dirk. If he's that willing to be publicly recognized, then he's no problem for us because he's not involved in it. Lance turned to Arthur Patterson. Mr. Patterson, you've been very quiet. What's the question you've been waiting to drop on us? Arthur Patterson smiled as he stubbed out a cigarette. He couldn't smoke in the White House. The president was a fanatic on fresh air, and he made up for his loss by chain-smoking every chance he had. He still had the smile as he looked up at Lance. A question I haven't heard voiced by anyone, Mr. Parker. I assume the group...
I assume the group you're trying to identify as to its lair is the same group you believe has the plutonium, and that they are attempting to assemble a bomb from this material. Of course, of course. But why, I wonder, did they ever take the plutonium at all? What are they going to do with it? And if they do put together their apparatus and they do have a bomb, what are they after?
The people assembled in the living room exchanged embarrassed glances. It was a question astonishingly simple, and they hadn't voiced it aloud. Now it hung in the air like heavy smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Very good, Mr. Patterson, Lance responded in the silence. First answer, yes, I'm convinced the student group we're tracking down as an undercover organization is the same group that has the plutonium. Second answer, they'll attempt to assemble their bomb because they haven't got enough crunch with just the plutonium. Let me stay with the bomb for a moment. It'll be a crude affair, a very heavy, very bulky device with a hell of a lot of battery power. That limits their means of transport. Lance shifted in his chair. Now, let's extrapolate in reverse, all right? Where is there a target within the restrictions of movement of this bomb? He looked about the room. Anybody got any favorites? The space shuttle facilities at the Kennedy Space Center? That bomb inside the vehicle assembly building could put us back for years. But, he said, his smile showing his sudden position as devil's advocate, they'd never get into the area if we increased security, so that's out. Dirk motioned to Lance.
What about a nuclear reactor plant? Ever since 3 Mile Island and that China Syndrome movie, that would certainly have its effect on the public.
Lance shook his head. Nope. Again, too much security to get into any place like that once it's alerted. And two, the story wouldn't hold together once scientists got through identifying the debris. It would be obvious the plant was blown up instead of blowing up on its own. His gaze went around the room. Jesus, can't anybody here see it? The FBI? The AEC? Anybody? Schaefer's face was contorted.
You've been making your digs all night, he snarled. All right, you smart son of a bitch, you tell us.
Dirk Martin swung to the FBI agent.
One more name calling like that and I'll throw you out of here myself, he warned.
Lance laughed aloud. Simmer down, Dirk. The man is frustrated. I'll tell you what they're after, what their target is and always has been. He paused, the smile thin and cold. It's right here. It's the university itself. The entire city of Gainesville, in fact. Can't you see it? This place has been a symbol for all universities because of its highly organized radical student groups, most of them very serious and dedicated to building a better world than destroying it. So they've made the university extremely visible. Ergo, the best of all targets, especially because the place is so damned vulnerable. Another reason is that by our staying right at home, all the effort we've expended in searching vehicles and monitoring roads and figuring out everything else has been worthless to us, and a beautiful decoy for them. Now, everybody hold it down. I know you've scoured this place with radiation monitors, but if the plutonium is sealed in lead and other materials, you can hold a Geiger counter right next to the bomb and get nothing of a signature. So don't blame yourself for failure in that department. Schaefer leaned forward.
When do you translate your supposition into hard fact? Are you ready to support the Bureau in rounding up these dissidents? We could do it in a matter of hours.
Schaefer, the truth is that it wouldn't do us a bit of good. In fact, Lance said, it would only make everything worse.
How the devil do you figure that?
Because of what a group of us did many years ago when we worked on the government's program to see just how well engineering students could do in building their own nuclear bombs from information available to any informed person. Lance let his gaze cover every person in the room. I was one of those young engineers, and while we've been hashing all this over in this room, the truth dawned on me. I'd like to say I knew it all the time, but that isn't the way it happened. It began to become obvious as we were going through our little family spat here. He leaned back in his chair. Damn, he hated staying in one position too long. He sighed and looked up again. Damn it, they've already built the bomb! He let the sudden uproar run its course. It didn't last long.
They were hanging on the edge to hear the rest of it. Don't you see? They, the student group, have known for a long time this program of energy output using plutonium would be coming to the university. They're smart, smarter than I gave them credit for. They did exactly what we did years ago. Since they knew the plutonium would be coming here, they built the bomb months ago. One sec, I'm getting called by somebody. Sorry about that. Haven't been too interruption heavy lately, other than things breaking, but this time. Where were we? Since they knew the plutonium would be coming here, they built the bomb months ago. They used lead as a dummy bomb material, assembled the bomb, and kept it hidden until they could grab the plutonium. Then they cut the plutonium in a machine shop to the sizes they wanted, which was easy enough since they could spread out the work in home shops and garages. Wouldn't that leave behind residual? And brought it back together for assembly into the final bomb, which they most likely have already put together. It wasn't a hot potato in their laps. It was a great lump of coal blazing fiercely. There were the obvious questions. Where was the triple damned bomb? Were the students really capable of detonating the weapon? How great would be the damage? And it all led to the question, what do they want? They had to get into the minds and thoughts of the student group, and that was a rocky pathway. They couldn't act the role of the bull in the china shop by making sweeping raids and arrests. There was no way to make a lightning strike through the campus and the school buildings because first, it would take too long. Second, did I read that correctly? That sounded baffling when it came out of my mouth. There was no way to make a lightning strike. Oh, there we go, because I'm thinking of actual. Never mind. There was no way to make a lightning strike through the emphasis on the right syllable. My apologies. There was no way to make a lightning strike through the campus and the school buildings because, first, it would take too long, second, the bomb might not be on the school grounds, and third, and most important of all, that could force or panic the students to set off the bomb. Lee seemed to be reading his thoughts. Lance, if they fire that weapon. She hesitated, dreading to voice it aloud. I mean, what happens? How bad would it be? He turned to her. At the very least, it would be pure hell. We've got about 20,000 tons explosive yield. We got about 20,000 tons explosive yield from the bomb we dropped over Hiroshima, and that was set off very high above the city for maximum blast effect. This weapon, well, it's impossible to figure. At its lowest level, they would have to get at least 2 to 4 kilotons, and at the high end, which I doubt, maybe 14 kilotons. My guess is a bomb equal to about 8,000 tons of explosive force. He addressed the group. Do you know what that means? All of the university will be torn apart. You'll have a crater several hundred feet in diameter. A good part of the city will be shattered. Because it'll be a ground burst, the fireball will be somewhat contained, but most of Gainesville will be set aflame. And after the heat pulse and the shock wave and the 1,000-mile-an-hour winds, we have a ground burst dissemination of intensely hot, really dirty radioactivity. That will carry slightly upwind, maybe a mile to the side of the winds, and will dump heavy radioactivity for 5 to 30 miles downwind, and minor hell 100 to 400 miles beyond that. He took a deep breath. There are, let's say, 100,000 people in this town, including the students. If more than 30,000 survive, and most of those will be burned and poisoned by fallout, it'd be a miracle. You could kiss off this university and the entire city. Period. And as far as I'm concerned, we should evacuate this city immediately, announced Dirk.
You might make them nervous, Lance said. They need the city as a hostage. If you so much as start a mass evacuation, boom.
But then they'd be killed along with the rest of us, Deirdre protested.
First, they might be willing to pay the price. Second, Lance added, they could set it off by remote control. A radio signal, a coded telephone call, anything. No, sorry. That reasoning won't sustain itself with the kind of dedication we're facing.
We still don't know what they want, Schaefer said.
I've got to agree with you, Lance said to the FBI man. That keeps us in a bind. We've got to find out their plans, and that, in turn, may tell us where the bomb is located, and that, in turn, tells us their plans. I know it's a crazy sort of catch-22, but we've got to find a way to break that circle. Again, he let his eyes rove the room. There's one thing they can't escape, he told the group. Wherever they have that damned thing, it needs power. It needs a minimum of physical space because of power and... Oh, God. It needs a minimum of physical space because of power and shielding. It's got to be so goddamned obvious we can't see that one tree because of the whole bloody forest surrounding us. But I know how these youngsters think, so it won't be where we'd look for power, like a generating plant or a machine shop or something so obvious. They're damnably clever. The security chief for the university shook his head. Then you'd better tell us how we find out what they plan without tipping our hand. There's a way, Lance said with a cold smile. When logic and rational thinking and orderly progress don't work, you turn to raw emotion. And that's what we're going to use.
You sound like you want a riot, Dirk said with concern.
Want? I'm going to orchestrate it, Lance promised him. Chapter 29. Deirdre, can you get me a list quickly of all the student organizations with any clout to them, overt and covert, just so long as they have enough people and muscle to get things done? Lance cupped a mug of coffee in both hands. The only people still in the house were Lance and Lee and the Martins. They were wrapping up, planning. Deirdre rifled through a file.
I already have it. It seemed an obvious reference to keep on hand.
Lance nodded to Dirk. She's still more efficient than the both of us put together, he said. Come over here and let's look at these names. He asked questions, got fast answers. You know, I'm starting to see the pattern, Lance said at last. It's no longer a case of an Arab group from any one country, or even a group of countries. The Indo-Iranians and Arab-Iranians have melted into the overall picture as well. Ever since Iran tore itself apart, that part of the world has been involved in not only in turmoil and turnovers, but in a whole new pattern of changing power and influence. The Middle East we all knew is gone.
You mean like Egypt and Israel? Deirdre asked.
I mean Egypt and Israel as a single entity, Lance confirmed. Not just in the let's quit fighting each other, but in the fact that they've pooled their military strength, and with a lot of American help, and they dominate all military strength throughout what we consider all of the Holy Land. And what did that produce? Arab countries that didn't know which way to turn. Islamic souls suffering in a helpless urge to return to the 17th century. History against modern times. Arab solidarity brought on by cash flow from oil to suppress historical bonds. I'm not quite prepared to turn this into an all-night current events seminar, but the upshot of it all is clear. These students from what we can call the desert worlds have formed their own loose but clearly identifiable coalition. The people we're trying to pinpoint have transformed rhetoric into action. And that kind of action meant planning ahead, building the bomb, and grabbing the plutonium when it arrived. They're brilliant, but they don't have experience, and that means they don't have the savvy of really dirty fighting. He glanced at the others. Like the house we rented here in town, he added.
I've been meaning to ask you about that, Dirk said. 1,000 a month, and you've got someone else living there. Why?
Because I want this group, which obviously has identified me through its own undercover organization within the campus life, to believe I'm in that house. Me and Lee. That way they don't look for us here. If they ever decide to do something against us at the house, they'll find some very tough and well-armed mercenaries we hired to take our place there.
Deirdre nodded. I'll buy that. More to the point, I'm sure those students believe you're in that house.
Lance shifted around swiftly. How familiar are you with Hillel? Hillel. Yeah, Hillel. He directed his question to Dirk.
I know them well enough, Dirk said. Everybody does, of course. They're a strong Jewish group, fiercely proud of their heritage, determined to keep Hebrew studies as much a part of the school program as black studies or even Arab studies.
Are they well supported?
They're not very large in terms of numbers of students, Dirk replied, but yes, they're well supported. The men and women who supply the money stay out of the action, so to speak. It's the youngsters, the firebrands, who really run the organization, and like any other organization, there's always a small ruling clique. That bunch has the chutzpah. They act like sabras, right out of a battle in the desert. They're very proud and
How much anti-Semitism here?
Dirk glanced at Deirdre before answering. Her nod confirmed they shared the same opinion. Some. It crops up every now and then. Mostly it's low key. Every now and then the haters get fired up and it gets a bit nasty. But the university steps very heavily on hate programs involving any group. In fact, that's one way they keep Matthew Krieger in line.
You'd better spell out some more on him.
Lance said. He's a young man, brilliant really, who's the organizational power behind the scenes of Hillel. He's also a part of the Blue Key organization here. They're involved with the upholding of what they consider to be minimum standards for this university. They include many alumni from well back in the history of the university, but the aspect to which I'm referring involves current student activity. Special events, homecomings, tradition, that sort of thing. Krieger is one member of this group, and he works hard for it.
What does he do with Hillel?
He's the firebrand. In fact, Dirk recalled, he's a cousin of Joel Katz, the man in charge of nuclear weapons security for Israel. He's hardly a stranger to any of this.
Deirdre, can you set up a meeting with him for me? Tonight?
Lance asked. I'll call. Any place in particular?
Let him pick it.
They sat together along a wall of the old College Inn on University Avenue, directly across from the campus. Heavy wood decor, beautiful stained glass. The food was excellent, the bar renowned, and the heated debates as much a part of the local scenery as the lights overhead. Debating went on mostly in a convivial manner, but at times it could be heated, and the manager always studied any unusually large group of students. If he so much as smelled trouble, he prepared for it. But it was rare, and this night he relaxed. He'd seen Matthew Krieger, and that could always charge the air. But tonight Krieger sat with an older stranger, and they were deep into their own thing. Then it started coming unglued. Four students, their sweater colors marking them unmistakably as from Hillel, were swiftly heating up an exchange with nearly a dozen other students the manager recognized as from the Arab student bloc. He signaled to his bartenders to be ready. They didn't wait long. The exchange graduated into insults, and the insults into shouts, and then curses and threats. Immediately, the manager switched off the music loudspeakers. He knew that sometimes hearing his own voice bouncing off the walls can quiet a man. It didn't work. A Jordanian student spit into the face of an intense youngster from Israel. The Sabra smiled at the Jordanian, but the smile disguised the fist that crashed into the nose of the other student. Blood flew, and there was a yelp of pain, and the Jordanian boy flew wildly through the air to crash into the midst of his own group. 9 against 4. Good odds for the husky youngsters from Hillel. Chairs crashed into the Arab group, and the manager saw knives flash. Holy shit, he swore, and motioned for someone to call the police.
He grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran to the group, spraying into faces and eyes. It had always been his most effective quencher for this sort of fire. Hissing, foaming, and super cold carbon dioxide did wonders. It would have done the same tonight, except that a half-dozen additional Arab youths burst through the entrance doors and ran gleefully into the melee. The manager spun about, caught the newcomers flush in the face with freezing foam. They stopped, skidded, tumbled, and were booted out the door. The police hit the inn from the front and the back doors and found a lot of people bloodied, one Hillel youth with a deep stab wound to the ribs, and no one, on either side, who knew a thing. Not until the place was quieted down and the mess cleaned up did it occur to the manager that the worst troublemaker of them all, Matthew Krieger, had never budged from his chair the whole time. The news of the brief battle at the inn, and the ugly mood accompanying its telling, spread swiftly through the campus. Reports ghosted through the university that violent reprisals, on both sides, were inevitable. Dirk Martin slowly replaced the telephone on its cradle in his living room. "That's the fourth call. The dean and the president are asking every teacher in the school to stand by for duty at any time to quell the disturbances. They seem almost sure to happen. Lance, what the hell are you so pleased about?" Lance smiled at his agitated friend. "Because it's going exactly as I planned." "But that's crazy!" Dirk shouted. "Don't you realize there are 40,000 students on that campus? They're hot-headed, and the radicals are dancing jigs about all the hell they can raise, and you sit there grinning like a Cheshire cat and tell me it's all wonderful." Lance nodded. "That's right. The key to all this is that we've got to make them believe things are going the way they want, that they are in control. Then they'll reveal themselves. It's vital we let this thing take its own course. It's the one hope we have to open doors while there's still time." "People can be killed." "So what?" Dirk stared at his friend. "I can't believe you said that." His face had pain on it. "You haven't been close enough to death on a large scale," Lance said quietly. "You can't measure this problem by trying desperately to prevent one or a dozen people from getting killed if that's the only way to find that bomb. This goes beyond your cherished principles, Dirk. Far beyond them." "You sure as hell don't sound like the Lance Parker I know," Dirk said angrily. "I'm not," Lance replied smoothly. "Let me try it your way. We stop the violence that's building. We arrest the ringleaders, lock 'em up. We put the lid on everything. And then that goddamned bomb explodes and kills 50 or 60 or maybe 80,000 people. The university is destroyed and so is the city. And then what are you going to do? Assuming, of course, you're not just so much glowing radioactive ash yourself. Wring your hands and wail how sorry you are?" Lance climbed stiffly to his feet, resting with both hands on his cane. "This is the only way we have to go. To get to the truth of it, it's our only hope." He started for the workshop, stopped to look back. "The next phase is under way. Will you be patient with me just a bit? I have a friend waiting for me in the workshop. I want you to meet him." Dirk nodded, unhappy. "All right, I'll wait." Sorry, throat scratchy. Dirk climbed slowly to his feet. He stared at the stranger with Lee, exchanged a puzzled look with Deidre, and then turned back to the young man who accompanied Lee Grazzi. He dwarfed her with his great shoulders and bulk. "Dirk, Deidre, this is Moshe Greenbaum." He gestured to her hosts. "Moshe, Dirk and Deidre Martin." The young giant with the bull neck, a thick black beard, and curly hair nodded. He extended a hand that enveloped that of Dirk. "It is my pleasure,"
he said in a low, rumbling voice. Professor Martin, of course. I saw what happened during the seminar. I wish I could apologize for that night on behalf of the students.
Thank you, Dirk murmured. He turned to Lee. Where's Lance?
Moshe Greenbaum answered. He had to go to a meeting with Krieger. He drove me here and they left together. Something came up that demanded his attention immediately. He asked me to apologize for the way he left so suddenly.
Greenbaum wore about his neck a thick gold chain, at the end of which hung a gold Star of David. Dirk gestured to it. Forgive what may seem a prejudiced remark, but with the mood at the university, after that fracas at the College Inn, wearing that symbol could cause you a great deal of trouble. Gleaming white teeth appeared in a broad smile, all the brighter against the dark beard.
I hope so, Professor. I dearly hope so.
Deidre showed her surprise. I don't understand. You want trouble? I should think we've all had enough of that.
Moshe shook his head. No, not yet. If trouble does not come to me, then I must seek it out. Make it.
That's ridiculous, Dirk snapped.
I apologize for disturbing you, he was told, but you made a promise to Mr. Parker, did you not, Professor?
I don't understand. What promise?
That you would not interfere. You see, I follow Mr. Parker's instructions.
You know what I promised Lance Parker? Dirk turned with undisguised anger to Lee. How the hell can he know that? I didn't think Lance would compromise what went on privately in this house. Lee remained unruffled by the sudden heat from her friend. He knows everything, Dirk. Oh, does he now? Dirk snapped. Does he really? Does he know that the Student Pan-Arab League is holding a rally tonight? That there'll be 1,000 fired-up students, maybe twice that many, demonstrating against nuclear energy plants? Against our own nuclear program here at the university? Does he know that after what happened today, if he walks among that crowd dressed like that, with a Star of David, he could cause a riot?
Again Greenbaum rocked him with that dazzling smile. Sir, that is my dearest wish. You will excuse me, please? It has been a pleasure to meet with you.
He was gone. They heard the car leaving. Dirk looked at Lee, his frustration boiling within him. Lance has gone crazy. This is the goddamnedest thing I ever heard of. He's not only happy about the idea of a riot, he's actually going to cause one, which is the 4th time we've heard that stated. Sorry. Repetition. Lee laughed. You went to school with Lance. You did the world tour with him. You jumped out of airplanes and climbed mountains and well, what's a little old riot or two? Dirk looked at his wife, then pointed to Lee. She's as crazy as Lance. Deidre shrugged. I get the distinct feeling, my dear, that we are not really in on what is happening. Moshe Greenbaum parked his car and set off at a brisk pace toward the open field. The glow from the floodlights was a wide beacon directing his movement. Then he heard the sounds and cursed. He broke into a swift run. Even from this distance he could hear the uproar. Damn! He was late. The rally had already disintegrated into a furious melee. He ran into the outer edges of the milling crowd and at a glance took in the situation. Clear enough, all right. The students from Hillel had gathered all their strength, maneuvering carefully into a well-rehearsed flying wedge, and, armed with everything from baseball bats to brass knuckles and mace, had charged the crowd, moving with military precision toward the speaking platform. In the process, they were smacking aside startled onlookers. Some people were hurt, many were terrified, and all were excited. Screams and shouts sounded over the general uproar, drowning the shouting, garbled voices from the platform. Greenbaum ran faster, his great bulk carrying him relentlessly through the crowd, knocking aside anyone in his way as he hammered his own path to the raised platform. Everything depended upon his reaching the small group who had assembled and were running this rally.
He needed desperately to identify them at just the precise moment, with emotion screeching raw and naked from their midst. Finally, he was far enough into the milling throng to see a ring of students, clubs and bats and knives and chains in their hands, forming a cordon before several people huddled beyond their defensive wall of bodies. That's them! That's them! Get in there fast! Greenbaum swerved without stopping in his run, his great fists and arms thudding and slamming people aside. He stopped suddenly as a thought pierced his own emotions. This was the wrong way to handle this. It wouldn't do for him to carry this act solo. He shouted to a group of Hillel students. This way! This way, damn you! They're over here! Come on! They took off at a dead run again, students swarming behind him. Closer to the defending cordon, he saw just how right he was. Behind the shoulder-to-shoulder guards, her face frightened and yet still in control of herself, was the girl, Lila Habail. And by her side, confirming everything he had already suspected, was none other than her brooding compatriot, Yasar al-Milah, his face already bloodied, his eyes wild. Greenbaum rushed the group. He was moving too fast to sidestep a man who jerked a gun from his belt, raised the weapon, and in that single smooth motion fired point blank at the human rhino charging him. The shot boomed through the shouting and screaming. People turned to see who would fall. Greenbaum grunted with the impact of the heavy slug into his leg, but he kept running forward, shouting curses, his great fist smacking the gunman along the side of his head before he could fire again. The gun flew wildly in one direction, and the man tumbled crazily in the opposite direction, blood already staining the side of his face. Greenbaum bulled through the cordon of bodies, a wild-eyed demon throwing aside tables and kicking chairs from his path. Then he was towering over Laila Habail. Screeching madly, Yasar al-Milah threw himself upon the big Hebrew, fingers clawing at his eyes. Greenbaum disposed of the maddened youngster with a single blow to his chest, and then his powerful hand closed over Lila's wrist. He jerked her down brutally, dragged her to the back of the platform. He was unprepared for the fanaticism of Al-Milah, who threw himself atop the big man's back, fingers clawing at his ears and eyes. Greenbaum had no time to waste. Still holding the girl, with his other arm he snapped Al-Milah's arm like a stick. The boy screamed with the terrible pain and fell away. Greenbaum pulled Lila close to his face. She looked into the dark eyes, the fierce beard, into the face of certain death. "The bomb!" Greenbaum shouted over the din. "Tell me where it is, or I'll twist your arm out of its socket!" She pulled frantically, her eyes wide, terrified. A club smashed against Greenbaum's head. He saw a great flash of red as he rolled aside instinctively, coming up with a spinning movement. Damn! He had no time. The club came down again, and he stepped inside the blow, his heavy shoe crashing into the groin of his attacker. There was a muffled gasp of pain. Greenbaum paid him no more attention and turned back to Lila, just in time to see her pulling a revolver from her purse. She fired point blank at the crazed giant before her. The blow was like an anvil in his chest. Greenbaum staggered backward, fighting for air and cursing at the same time. Even through the woven metal and plastiskin of the ManFac, that had been a terrifying impact. He roared with his rage and charged. Lila stared with disbelief, fired again. This time her aim was off as the shot thundered in Greenbaum's ears, but he felt the bullet plow into the same leg that had been struck before. The way the foot jerked, a sudden and violent spasm, he knew he'd taken damage to critical wiring. He smacked the gun from her hand, and, without thinking, unable to stop the instinctive move, his other hand struck her harder than he intended along the side of her face. She whirled about like a rag doll and crumpled unconscious to the ground. "You fool! You—" Lance Parker's eyes, in the face of Moshe Greenbaum, froze on the purse of Lila Habail, where its contents lay scattered by her unconscious form. A key with a tag lay in plain view. He sucked in his breath, an icy wind rushing through him. My God, that's it! That's where they've got the bomb! Right under our noses! He turned and ran, feeling his left leg dragging, moving more slowly than the right, so that his movement was a crazy scuttling motion. He heard sirens and police shouting for him to halt. He pulled his head down, forcing himself to run faster. Shots rang out, and he felt a mule kick him in his shoulder. Cursing, he rolled to the ground, beyond bushes, skidded down an incline, and then he was on his feet again and running in that crazy scuttle for the College of Journalism. Chapter 30. He hit the main doors to the building at full speed, throwing his shoulder into the center. Glass shattered and metal screeched as the lock broke apart and he plunged into the lobby. He paused for a moment to find his bearings. All the time he'd been running for the college center, he'd been thinking furiously. There would be one place and one place only in this building that had all the ingredients they needed to handle the bomb. Power, plenty of equipment to conceal the device, communications, and unnoticed and open access to and from the room where they kept the weapon. There was only one area that had 220-volt power cables in extensive use. I lost my spot. There was only one area that had 220-volt power cables in extensive use, as well as workrooms, as well as workrooms and power systems and batteries. The television broadcasting studios of the College of Journalism. It fitted hand in glove. One large wheeled container marked video equipment, or film, kept locked, on wheels so it could be moved easily, wouldn't attract the first bit of attention, especially when you kept a group of your own people present at all times to keep an eye on things. He recalled something he'd heard in Dirk's house. The Arab students, especially those working with Aramco, were producing Arabic language television shows of Sesame Street, and that made the cover for the radical groups all the more secure. Lance in the ManFac of Moshe Greenbaum pounded up 3 flights of stairs, and was appalled to find himself looking down a long corridor with television studios to each side. He went down the corridor like an engine of destruction, smashing open locked doors. He had no time for keys. It was in the 6th studio, pushed against a wall, and just as he'd expected. A heavy wheeled and locked case marked video equipment. What drew his eye was the combination lock. Every other equipment case had a lock that opened with a key. It had to be what he sought. Why else lock the case with a combination lock inside a locked studio? He studied the case, forcing down his impatience. Thank God, there were no wires leading to the case and no antennas he could detect. He heard feet pounding along the corridor, coming closer. 2 students burst into the studio. "Hey, you're not allowed in here! Who are you?" The questions came in staccato fashion, and he felt relieved again. Their appearance meant no one else had been in here tonight to set up a booby trap detonator. Then he heard words that made him freeze. "Damn it, Johnny, I'm calling the police!" Lance spun about. There wasn't time to explain. He hated what he had to do to innocent youngsters, but he stepped forward and dropped each youth with a ripping punch to the stomach. He dragged them out of sight behind a desk and turned back to the heavy case. Even the ManFac system couldn't break the lock, but these kids had made a common mistake. Their lock was many times stronger than the hasp riveted to the case. He grasped the lock and pulled, bracing himself for every ounce of strength those motors and cables in his arm and hand could supply. The metal bent, and then the rivets tore loose. He opened the case carefully and laid the cover all the way back against its hinges. He couldn't believe the pounding of his heart. He tried to convince himself that if he made a single wrong move, he'd never know it, would be reduced to free atoms before the first trickle of thought could move through his brain. It didn't help. He looked down without moving, studying, trying to remember the bomb systems he'd worked on in the past. The equipment was just as he'd figured. The students had access to published material on the original bomb design used against Hiroshima, simplicity itself. Grooved chambers. The plutonium halves well separated and shielded from one another at opposite ends of the long shotgun type of barrel. On each end of the shotgun system, at the back of each half of plutonium of subcritical mass, there was a rocket boost unit and... Good God! He murmured aloud. Those rockets. He knew them. RATO systems to assist aircraft in making short field takeoffs. Common enough and safe. But these were old surplus units, and that meant they were unstable. The bloody fools. If the rockets fired properly, each ignited with the same electrical charge, they would ram the two halves of plutonium together and keep them together long enough to reach the K factor, when the plutonium achieved sufficient mass and size to release an uncontrolled fission reaction. The Big Bang itself. 60 or 70 or 100 million degrees in a self-contained eternity. The exact temperature determined the overpressure and the force of the killer shockwave booming outward, and the earthquake shock and all the other effects associated with the nuclear detonation. He was mesmerized by the rocket boosters. They scared the absolute hell out of him. The longer they were kept beyond their to-be-destroyed date, the more brittle and unstable they became. If one of them were fired accidentally, and you could do that simply by jarring the goddamned thing, it would slam the two plutonium halves together and create, at the minimum, a fiercely radioactive soft explosion. A sort of nuclear pop that would still kick out an explosion greater than 1,000 tons of nitro. A jarring impact, static electricity, even a microwave beam, almost anything would set off these suckers. He studied the mechanism with more deliberation, found the connecting wires. He had no tools, and there wasn't time to find any. The ManFac fingers would have to do. He unscrewed the hold-down bolts to the wires and removed them with infinite care. His breath released in a gasp. He'd disconnected the batteries. That was one step on the way to immobilizing this hellish contraption. But it wasn't enough. He didn't even dare try to remove the rocket boosters. If he slipped... The only way to make this thing safe, without the right time and tools, was to get the whole works under water. Immerse it completely. Water soak would soon cut the whole assembly into a safe mess. He strained against the casing. At least 500 pounds. Normally, the exoskeletal framework of the ManFac could handle the weight. But not now. Not with that left leg jerking in fitful spasms he couldn't predict. He had to reduce the weight. He removed the heavy batteries. Okay, now for the lead shielding. He hesitated. Plutonium was a metal. Its radioactivity wasn't dangerous in a pure form. You could hold a chunk of it in a leather or asbestos glove at arm's length and be safe. But this wasn't pure, and it lacked that comfortable safety margin. Screw it. You've got to gamble. Besides, the ManFac provides some shielding. Lance rolled his eyes to whatever deity above was exercising its macabre sense of humor. He reached into the mechanism, freed the clamps for the lead shielding. A Geiger counter immediately sounded a rash of clicking sounds, a billion radioactive crickets that wouldn't go away. Oh, Jesus, he moaned. He'd flashed back to that sphere beneath the mountain. Got to stop that. Concentrate on now. Now. Now! The batteries were gone. The heavy lead shielding was gone. He could lift the bomb mechanism from the case. He reached down, balancing himself as best he could on that damned twitching leg. He lifted slowly, figuring the weight at 200 pounds. Normally, he would have heaved that weight into his arms like lifting a small child. He still had the arm power, but unbalanced as he was, the weight made his leg as slippery as a greased pig beneath him. Still, time was running out. There were police on the way. Those students might revive, and the longer he delayed, the worse that leg became. He lifted the bomb so that it was cradled against his chest and resting on both arms. He tried to force himself not to think of that radiation streaming invisibly from what he carried like an infant before him. Through the doorway, moving sideways, into the long corridor. His left foot began to drag behind him. Balance was a nightmare. He scuttled carefully along the corridor, close to the wall in the event his balance went. He could always try to cushion any impact from setting off those rocket boosters. You won't feel a thing, sweetheart. Don't even give it a second thought. The stairway before him. He made the turn slowly. He took the steps only one at a time, leaning his shoulder against the wall, descending in a strange, shuffling, slow slide. It seemed an hour before he reached the second floor. 2 more flights to go. 1 more flight. He slipped, jammed his weight against the wall. The leg wanted to jitterbug beneath him. He pressed hard, using the friction of weight and strength against the wall as he went down the last flight of stairs. Before him were fire exit doors. They could be opened only from the inside by the pressing of a door-wide lever, but they'd set off the night alarm. No way out of that. He went through the door sideways, his hips shoving the lever forward and down. Alarm bells clamored about him. Forget them. Keep going. He perspired profusely within the ManFac, salt stinging his eyes. The ManFac was still functioning, but his own body was draining away its energy like water through a fire hose. He was outside, maybe 200 yards to go to reach the shore of the campus lake. He speeded up. He speeded up. I don't know why I'm not enunciating my consonants. Probably dehydrated. Anyway, where were we? He speeded up. If he went partially sideways, he took some of the weight off the leg. His movement was a swaying, drunken, half-running gait. He saw flashlights coming around the corner of the building. He forced himself to keep his pace. Any faster, and he might fall. Goodbye, University. Goodbye, Gainesville. So long, Lee. It's been great. Shut up! Voices shouted at him. Feet pounded, running, after him. The lake shore was closer. He saw streetlights reflecting from the water. A warning shot cracked through the night air. Shouts. Another shot. He kept going, desperate, crazy to reach the lake. He was close now, the water beckoning to him. He blinked, cursing the sweat in his eyes. The ManFac life support system was shorting out from the damage to the leg, and he was heating dangerously. But now he was at the edge of a grass slope leading directly to the water. He summoned all his strength and made a last desperate run, a maniacal motion just short of stumbling helplessly. A bullet crashed into his right shoulder. It deflected from the suit with a metallic scream, but it threw him off balance, and he was falling. He threw himself into the fall, going with it, lunging for the water and at the same time twisting so that he would fall backward to protect the hellish mechanism in his arms. He braced for impact with the ground. Water splashed heavily all about him. We made it! He went under the surface like a boulder, twisting again, easier this time. He felt soft surface beneath him. He knew he must keep moving to prevent sinking into the mud near the shoreline. He must get the bomb into the deepest water possible. It would need at least 20 minutes of soaking to dampen the rockets so they wouldn't fire. If he remained by the shore, they might unwittingly retrieve the bomb before the rockets were disabled. He pushed ahead blindly, leaning like a deep-sea diver into his movement. He could barely guide himself by the lights wavering and dreamlike from the lamps along the campus walkways. Then he could carry the weight no more. Not his own weight, not another foot. Oh, I misread that, sorry. Then he could carry the weight no more, not his own weight, another foot. He bent over to lower the bomb gently into the mud. Exhaustion scourged him. He felt the cold touch of water coming into the ManFac. He must keep moving. He flailed with his arms, kicking with one leg, the other sparking from the now soaked short circuits. Dizzy, exhausted, he heard a warning from his own mind that the ManFac had become a death trap. He must release himself. He took a final deep breath and pressed the switch for full manual override. If only the system still worked. The backups came into play. The panels along the back of the ManFac slid aside, and he eased away from the now inert form as it fell slowly into mud. He forced himself not to gasp for air as the water struck him like an icy whip. Then he was completely free, lungs bursting for air. He clawed at water to propel himself upward, shaking uncontrollably. He was shivering inside and out, and he knew his muscles were knotting and cramping. He had no more than a minute before he would double up into a pain-racked ball. His head cleared water, and he gasped air like an animal, no thought behind his sucking, gulping motions. His head cleared, but the cold savaged him. He swam desperately for the nearest lights. Closer. He felt soft mud beneath one foot, and he grasped for a bush, dragging himself onto the shore like a dog with palsy. That's specific. He heard sirens, men shouting. He retched violently as he made the campus walk. Lying on his side, everything blurred. The world was spinning, and a light exploded in his eyes. "Over here! Someone get an ambulance!" The flashlight was on him again, and he felt a policeman's jacket on his body. He looked up, teeth chattering, body shaking. His skin blue. "Robbed!" he gasped out. "Two men mugged me, stole clothes. Help! Need help! Call Professor Martin! Hurry! Call!" Blackness. Chapter 31. The light coalesced from darkness, unfreezing from eternal darkness. Lance's eyes were locked open. He wanted desperately to close them, to block out the terrible glare, but he couldn't. He was being forced to watch the tiny mote blossoming outward, white beyond white, perfectly round, a sphere of pure energy. Then there appeared the first caress of pink along the edges of the expanding white, glowing within itself, and there was white, and then the pink, and then the orange and red and fiery glowing blood appeared, and he knew he was witness to the nucleus birth of the atomic fireball that spread faster and faster and became a great blossoming creature writhing within itself, a terrible rosebud unfurling with shocking speed, and he heard the thunder begin, the drum roll of the end and beginning of eternity, and the thunder broke apart into a dog screaming in pain, and there was a crazy strangling boom that came from within himself, and "Easy, take it easy. You're having a nightmare." Hands held him down, and he snapped his eyes open, looking into Lee's face. The strangling sounds had come from his own throat, and he tried to move, but her hands were strong, and her voice kept soothing him. Then he was back to reality, and he saw beyond Lee and focused on the pale green walls of the hospital room. "My God!" he gasped. "What a nightmare!" He shook his head slowly, still fighting off the horror. Lee held a glass and straw to his mouth, and he sipped water. "Lean back," Lee told him, and he let himself collapse into the pillows. She dabbed at his face and neck with a towel. "You all right now?" she asked. "Yeah, sure. I'm out of it. Where the hell am I? It looks like a hospital and—" "Alachua General. That was quite a night you had," she said with a smile. "Are we alone?"
"Yes. Dirk and Deidre stayed with me, but I convinced them to go home when the doctor said you wouldn't be awake for several hours. A great many people are frantic to talk with you, but the police put a guard outside the door, and we won't be bothered."
"I need some damn coffee and a cigar," he said.
Lee went to the door, spoke with the police officer. She returned with a mug of coffee. "I brought along your cigars. God knows you deserve one." He sipped slowly, waiting as she held his lighter for him. He took a long, deep, shuddering breath and let it out slowly. It was okay. It was good.
Relax. Relax, man. The last thing I remember, he said slowly, was lying on that sidewalk freezing to death. And, and, he fought for memories. Yeah, I remember now. Police. I told them I was mugged. Did they buy it?
They did. They brought you here in an ambulance. They called Dirk, and we got here as fast as we could. By then you'd been given a shot, and they had you pretty well under control. Shock, exhaustion, cramps, what you would expect. She kissed him gently. I am so pleased about you. Not what happened, about you yourself. Your recovery is marvelous. And what you need now is a long hot bath. Maybe even another cigar when this one is done.
It was 81. We knew those caused cancer. Of course I thought you hated these cigars.
Of course I do. They smell like. Never mind. I love you. The cigars come with you.
Damn right, he growled, but couldn't avoid the smile. By the way, what time is it?
4:30.
In the morning?
Uh-huh.
Can you fill me in? It's important. Let me finish this coffee while you speak. She brought a chair to his bedside.
Everything ended Everything ended perfectly, Lance. Placing the bomb in the water was sheer genius. You
Not me, he interrupted. Moshe Greenbaum. Does anybody know yet about me?
Lee shook her head. I was going to tell Dirk and Deidre about ManFac, but decided that was up to you.
We'll see later. Go on, hun.
They pulled the bomb from the water about 2 hours after they found you. I saw it, by the way. Not the bomb. One of those rockets. Soaked through. They couldn't have fired.
Thank God, he murmured. It was so damn close.
Yes, it was, she agreed.
What about the ManFac?
No one knows it's in the water. It's about 14 feet down. We can arrange to have it removed one night.
Are they still looking for Moshe Greenbaum?
She laughed with delight. Are they ever? The whole town is going crazy to find him. He's the new hero of Gainesville.
Lance smiled. They've got a long look ahead of them.
I've got better news. They've identified the students leading the group that stole the plutonium. You were right. That boy and those two girls were running the whole show. They're in custody. Hospital custody, I should say. Greenbaum was pretty rough on 'em. You ready for more good news?
He took a long, comfortable drag on the cigar. Try me.
Dirk called a while ago to say that the university has drawn a check for $250,000. She squeezed his hand gently. Lance, we've done it. We've opened the door to our future. And in the process, I might add, you saved the university and a city and perhaps 100,000 people from a horrible death.
Lance looked about him. I hate hospitals, Lee.
I know that. And you want the hell out of here, and right now, right?
Right. Where the hell are my clothes?
In that closet.
Please, lover, help me get dressed. I don't think Dirk'll mind if we show up at this hour.
Mind? They're going crazy waiting to talk with you. She brought his clothes to him. You start getting dressed. I'll call Deidre and tell her we'll be there soon. And don't worry about checking out of here. The police are handling everything.
He sat on the edge of the bed. Just those few hours of sleep had done him a world of good. He was beset with a flood of emotions that challenged rational thinking. Lee had said it simply, but so very well.
I am so pleased about you yourself.
That meant more to her than everything he'd done in his astonishing performance to recover the bomb, find the subversive group, save the city, and God, he'd come full swing, all right. He dressed slowly as Lee spoke with Deidre, hung up, and returned to him.
Need some help? She asked.
He waved her off. I'm still a bit rocky, but it feels so damn good to do this all by myself. Except that I don't have that cane and... She held it up for him. Thanks. He slipped into loafers. I know this sounds crazy, especially after everything we did with those ManFacs, but being me is pretty damn great.
She seemed to sober her mood. Don't ever forget what I once told you. ManFac can't do a thing for you. It's the other way around.
It sounds good, but without what you did... He shook his head. No one has tied us together? Really?
Really? she said, her own self-satisfaction radiating from her. There'll never be any doubt any more. You changed from one person to another right under their noses, and they have no idea, absolutely none, that you were— She stopped short. Something I read, she said, speaking slowly. Some wild stories out of Atlanta. It's beginning to fit. Is that where you— He grinned impishly.
Sure was.
How incredible! How beautiful! The strength of that system is so beyond anything I ever dreamed it could have.
It could have.
The strength of that system is so beyond anything I ever dreamed it could have.
Well, we know one thing for sure. ManFac system or not, you can get hurt, even killed in that thing. He rubbed several places on his body. My chest feels like it was hit by a—
Bullet, she finished for him. And it was, remember?
Do I ever? We ready to go?
In a moment. I want to ask you something. How in the world could you carry that bomb with one leg shot up the way it was? The story is everywhere that Greenbaum was shot several times, including several bullets in one leg.
He nodded. The crazy thing about that is that it felt like I was shot. Sorry. The crazy thing about that is that it felt as if I were shot. I mean, the ManFac should have felt pain, and it did feel the pain.
The telephone rang. Lee answered the call, and Lance waited. Of course, that'll be all right. I think it's wonderful. Yes, yes, we'll wait here in the room. Bye. She hung up and turned to Lance. That was Deirdre. She says they're going crazy waiting for us and they'd like to pick us up personally. I couldn't tell them no.
He waved aside any objections. That'll be great. In the meantime, I could use another coffee.
Coming right up, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sir.
He sat quietly on the bed, feeling his strength returning slowly but steadily. Every time he tried to think coherently, he found his mental track besieged by feelings of accomplishment, wonder, even awe at what he had managed to bring off. He mused about their future. If they had been able to do so much on their first try, why, there was no limit to what they might accomplish in the future. They could set up a complete investigating team, bring in all the startling developments of Lee. He looked up as she returned with the coffee. I think I'll share this one with you. I could use a pick-me-up. They were content to sit for several minutes without speaking, enmeshed in their own thoughts. Then they heard the police officer.
Go right on in, Professor, Mrs. Martin. They're waiting for you.
A jubilant Dirk and Deirdre rushed into the room to throw their arms about Lance and smother him with a bear hug from Dirk and wild kisses from his wife. They laughed like children. It was several minutes before they managed to calm down enough to speak coherently with one another.
Lance, I spoke to one of the policemen who saw Moshe Greenbaum carrying that bomb, Dirk said with excitement. He also said it was the most incredible thing he'd ever seen. Greenbaum took several shots, and he somehow managed to keep right on going. And then he just vanished into thin air after getting the bomb into the lake.
He'll show up,
Lance said quietly. You know where he went? They'd like to hang 100 medals around his neck, Dirk said.
Lance shook his head. I know that youngster. He's, well, very special is a good phrase for it.
Very special? Dirk laughed. He's astounding. To think of the punishment he went through, and yet he carried that bomb down 3 flights of stairs and was shot again and still managed to get a bomb weighing 200 pounds down to the water and—
Lance waved a weary arm. Later, Dirk, okay? Let's just get home first. Dirk nodded, apologetic.
Sometimes I forget what you just went through, he said quickly. You're right. Home it is.
He hurt in every muscle as he walked the long corridor to the elevator, and he had to use his cane. But it was a sweet trip indeed. Chapter 32. Lance sprawled on the couch, luxuriating in the plush softness about him.
Dirk hung up the phone, looking slightly bewildered. I just spoke to Edward Duncan, the sheriff. He's in his car on his way here, and so is Stan.
The chief of police, right?
Dirk nodded. Uh-huh. I thought I'd get some static. I mean, with its being almost done, and they couldn't wait to get here to find out how you and your team did what you did. He laughed, just a bit nervously. For that matter, I'm on pins and needles myself. Lance exchanged a glance with Lee. They were the entire team, if you didn't count the ManFacs. Soon they were assembled together in the living room, coffee and some needed brandy shared by all. Stan Corey leaned forward in his seat. He was a powerful man, and muscles bulged beneath his uniform.
I don't mind saying, Mr. Parker, that I've been in this business a very long time, like Ed here, and neither one of us knows quite how the devil you managed what you did.
Duncan gestured to break in.
Well, Mr. Parker, is that fella Greenbaum. A gnat couldn't hide from us in this city, and no one has the slightest idea where he is. Let me ask you directly, is he still here in the city?
Lance shifted position.
I don't want to seem evasive, he said slowly, but I'm not going to answer that. Well, let's call it playing the matter close to the chest. Greenbaum is no longer a factor in this conversation. That's the way we work.
The police chief and the sheriff exchanged a glance, accepted the inevitable, and nodded. Corey set aside his coffee cup.
All right.
Oh, all right, sir. It's your ball game. Would you mind telling us how you knew where to find the bomb, or how Greenbaum and your other people carried it off, pulled it off?
Lance looked about the room, absolutely silent, waiting for his words.
He smiled. I had to go back to square one, the old saw of starting at the beginning, and the first thing I told myself was that you should never underestimate the opposition. But that works both ways. The opposition, in this case, had its own mental Achilles heel. They looked on us strictly as police, the law, the higher authority, and they forgot that we would think just like they did. For some strange reason, the kids always forget that we went through the same drills they go through, and not all of us forget what we did. I put myself in their place, and then I added what they lacked.
Experience, for one, Duncan tossed into the conversation, and knowledge beyond their reach.
Precisely, Lance confirmed. Technical knowledge peculiar to this specific situation. The convolutions of nuclear danger are endless, and I'm a hell of a lot closer to its horrors than these kids. They've never seen a nuclear bomb explode. I have. They haven't been drowned in radiation. I was. There's also common sense, if you can detach yourself from the immediacy of your problem. Let's add that intrinsic working knowledge of how to think like a student. And never forget that these were damned smart students. I had to get back to their level but be even smarter. For quite a while they were leading me down the primrose path.
You've lost me, Deirdre broke in. You always seem to be one jump ahead of them. That student organization, I mean.
Lance shook his head. Not for a while, love. Because these kids figured out we would react to given situations. So I had to change the situation and force them to act emotionally.
How did you manage that?
Dirk asked. You know how. I started a riot.
Lance said casually.
You started that riot? Corey demanded. But that was a pan-Arab rally. Lance shook his head. No, it wasn't. The kids thought it was because we, my group, orchestrated it that way. You were supposed to think the same thing.
But why? Deirdre asked, almost visibly floundering to find sense in the machinations Lance was describing.
We knew which ones believed must have the plutonium, and had the means and the reasons to build the bomb, but we still had no clue to where they had it, or how they were going to use it. All I could gamble on was that in the excitement they'd give us that clue. They'd have to be carrying with them anything important to them. He took a deep breath and went on. As it turned out, Moshe Greenbaum pulled it off. We used Afsar Husain to time the rally, to fire up the kids. Then Greenbaum made his move. He went through the crowd like a steamroller. When he found the girl, Lila Habail, by the speaker's platform, she was carrying a gun, and tried to kill him with it. He knocked her to the ground. Her books fell, and her purse burst open, its contents scattering. There it was, right in front of Greenbaum, a key marked Property of the College of Journalism. It didn't take much to add up the elements of electrical power, heavy equipment, lots of storage room. Well, Greenbaum went right to the bomb. You know the rest.
Jesus, Dirk said, shaking his head. If that thing had ever gone off.
He let the unnecessary words hang unsaid among them. Lance climbed slowly to his feet, accepting Lee's help. He couldn't sit in one position. He was still too fired up, too tense, to remain any longer in one position. He had his own private bomb to drop on them. He stopped in the room's center, leaning with both hands on his cane. The expression on his face was so unusual it seemed to mesmerize them. There's the beginning of another atomic bomb here in Gainesville. As he expected, no one spoke for a moment, and the only audible expression was a gasp or two. Finally, Stan Corey spoke, briefly and to the point. Where? Most likely in a garage, a workshop or something.
You seem awfully damn casual about it, Duncan remarked.
Because everything points to the fact that they haven't assembled it yet. We'll find out where the plutonium is sometime today or tomorrow at the latest, by putting full surveillance on the airport.
How do you know about it? Dirk asked.
All of us missed the obvious, Lance said, obviously with some self-chagrin. We have the bomb Moshe Greenbaum carried into the lake. It weighed 200 pounds. We were missing 200 pounds of plutonium, and it all evened out. But we forgot the weight of the bomb mechanism and the rockets. He let it hang in there until Stan Corey looked in self-amazement at Edward Duncan. How could we have been so blind? He asked the other man. Don't blame yourselves, Lance broke in. I asked myself the same question, and not until I realized that the total package Greenbaum carried weighed 200 pounds did I see what should have been obvious, that we were still missing 200 pounds. You see, he said dryly, those kids were smarter than we thought. From the very beginning, they planned to build 2 bombs. They planned way ahead. They figured we'd be super smart, so they built the first bomb and expected us, sooner or later, to find it. And that would be the end of the story. For all I know, they were going to lead us to it. They certainly wanted us to believe that they were going to use it here. All their demands were against the university. In the meantime, they'd shaped the rest of the plutonium for They'd shaped the rest of the plutonium for shipment to their real destination, probably as components of industrial machinery, and were preparing to ship it out. Assembling the bomb at this point would have been foolish, since all they wanted abroad was the plutonium. How exactly are they doing that without irradiating the ever-loving bejesus out of everything in the area? I know it's not... No, you don't want to do that. I don't know how you go about machining plutonium. I'm not a nuclear physicist or engineer. But it seems like that would be a difficult ask. It's nice to say, but I don't see how they could have done it. But I don't know. And we're preparing to ship it out. Assembling the bomb at this point would have been foolish, since all they wanted abroad was the plutonium. The smart thing to do was to conceal the plutonium in lead. That way it could be broken down into packages, each easily handled by one man. Edward Duncan gestured.
You figured out where they were shipping it? What they planned to do with it?
Generally, yes, Lance responded. The key to that little puzzle lay in the nature of the student group. Deidre broke in. I think I see your point. The nature of the student group. They weren't from any one country. A cigar for the lady, Lance complimented her. Radical students, right? What's been happening to that long-lived goal of the Arabs to wipe Israel off the face of the earth? Egypt and Israel, with American support, are allies. They pulled Jordan's teeth and have the Syrians almost catatonic. Saudi Arabia needs American assistance, so they've laid back. Libya's all hothead and backstabbing. To an Arab youngster who believes in the grand old traditions, the new leaders are toothless old hags. To these kids, Islamic morality was being sold out for the big oil buck. Iran fell apart, the Russians are scaring the hell out of everybody, and the Arabs are sitting on the fences. Lee brought fresh coffee to Lance and took over. These kids were going to break some fences, she added on. They would pick up the cudgel by setting off an atomic bomb somewhere in an Israeli city. An enraged Israel would go all out, and you can bet a few Arab cities would have gone up in nuclear blasts. One more element began to fit. It takes money and organization to do all this. Do you recall Yasser al-Millah, one of the student leaders? His father is an OPEC billionaire. The kid has scads of money and the use of his father's jet to return home when he wants. So he arranged a holy visit, and the bomb would have gone with him. As a sheik's son, all inspection requirements would have been waived. He would go right through in his father's airplane. Instead, he's safe inside a hospital. Lance shook his head slowly. I have to give that kid credit. He wasn't much of a talker, but he was willing to die for his beliefs. Stan Corey showed open disbelief. You give him credit, Mr. Parker? Not me. Not Ed either. He could have wiped out all of Gainesville, killed a few 100,000 people back home, maybe started a war, and you give him credit? Lance smiled. I didn't say I liked him, he retorted quietly. I never thought Napoleon was personally appealing either, but I give him credit for shaking up the establishment. Lance returned slowly to his seat. Chief, Sheriff, I'm wrung dry. Whatever you need to know, it comes later, okay? They shook hands. You're one hell of a guy, Parker, Corey told him. Duncan stood by.
Let me put it another way, Parker. Forget the big numbers. My family may be alive just because of what you did here. Thank you.
Lance and Lee told the Martins the next day. He dropped it on them with the subtlety of a left hook. Dinner was behind them, and they were enjoying brandy. You two, Lance said carefully, will be the only people besides Lee and myself who know the truth. We trust you. He paused. Afsar Husain and Moshe Greenbaum are the same person. Dirk and Deidre nearly dropped their drinks. They received only a smile from Lee.
It's his story, she said.
The same person? Dirk echoed. That's impossible.
Hang on for the next one, Lance chuckled. Hussein, Greenbaum, and Parker are all the same person.
Deidre looked at Lee. He's flipped out.
Lee only shook her head. Lee made it all possible. Lance came in quickly for her. You know the work she was doing with her automated human systems. What you didn't know was that she made a quantum jump in her work. She integrated human exoskeleton android systems into one which we call ManFac, short for man-facsimile.
It's more than that, really, Lee offered. Lance can be virtually anyone he selects to be.
Amazement crowded Dirk's voice.
But how could you be them? The differences in size, the voice, facial expressions, everything. It can't be possible.
It is. I was in those manfacs. They're tailored, so to speak, to the nth degree of compatibility, or symbiosis, with Lance Parker, Lance said of himself. That's why I asked you to give me your word never to go into your own workshop. The manfacs are in there.
My God, Deidre murmured. You mean Hussein and Greenbaum are right in that next room?
Afsar is. Moshe is still at the bottom of the lake, where I had to leave him. We'll have to work out a way to recover the system one night. There's no rush. We'll let things calm down first.
I confess, Dirk said slowly, that with everything I knew about you two, I am still flabbergasted.
They watched in silence as Lance demonstrated the manfac in the person of Afsar Husain. When he finished, they returned to the living room, for a while strangely quiet, engrossed in their thoughts about the ManFac simile system.
I have some ideas, Dirk blurted out suddenly. I'm sure that with some developments we've had on the back burner for a while, I could increase the versatility of the system.
I'll take 'em,
Lance said quietly.
What are your plans now? Deirdre asked. You know you're welcome to stay here with us. You also have that big house you rented here, and
Lance shook his head. Short and sweet, Deirdre. As soon as we find that plutonium, it's time to move on. We have plans.
tell us.
Lance took Lee's hand in his own. Some plastic surgery, for one. We have the money to get into it, to start rebuilding this mangled carcass of mine. New bionics, prosthetics, you know. I want to walk without this damned cane.
And I and I want a new lab, Lee said. No matter what you've seen so far, ManFac right now is just a beginning. Lance has proved we have something absolutely unique in the way of special investigation and undercover operations. There are a great many people and corporations that'll pay handsome sums for services that only we can deliver.
Her excitement showed through her faster speech and shining eyes.
What would you think about an electromagnetic field lifting system, for example?
Dirk looked at his wife.
You realize what she's saying? In effect, they can levitate the ManFac.
He turned to Lee.
What about balance?
She shrugged. Details. Small 100,000 RPM gyros. Auto-stabilizing systems we can improve from satellite balancing mechanisms. That's just for starters. Levitation, Deirdre said in awe. The dream come true.
Not levitation, Lance said firmly. Scientific.
She waved off his correction. To anyone who doesn't know, it is damned well levitation, and it could have tremendous psychological effect as well. Well, it's as practical as going to the moon, Lee chimed in, and that's ancient history by now.
Lance drifted through his own thoughts as the others talked. The possibilities truly were incredible. He'd made that fifth law of his mean something. They could do a lot with that. And there should be a sixth law just around the corner, and there were always more corners to turn. Because the sixth law, if he had his thinking cap on straight, should be his own determination to live meaningfully. He knew. He'd been to the brink and beyond, and he'd come back. Now, however, there was that long-awaited and deserved vacation, and... The phone rang. Dirk took the call, and they looked at him with questions in their expressions. It wasn't often you heard every other phrase out of Dirk Martin as, "Yes, sir." Dirk cupped the mouthpiece.
It's for you,
he said after a pause. He had the strangest look on his face. Who is it? Lance asked.
The president.
Oh, the university, of course.
No, the president of the United States.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not.
You've got to be kidding.
Will you, for God's sake, talk to the man?
Lance took the phone. This is Lance Parker.
Lance, this is the president. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, sir. Several minutes later, he handed the telephone slowly to Lee, who grabbed it from his hand and replaced it on the table. He stared at the others. He has a problem. He says he was kept fully informed of how we handled the bomb problem here in Gainesville, and he's intrigued by our special staff. Lance blinked. But it's just Lee and me. Dirk shook his head, and he smiled.
No, you're wrong about that. Don't you understand? It's you and Lee and ManFac, as well as many of those alter egos of yours as you need. I'd say that was one hell of a special staff.
Amen. And that was ManFac by Martin Caidin. Kind of an abrupt ending. When it gets into the climax, it's like, oh, well, that's done. Pretty quickly. But it's a fun, cute little romp. It's a bit dated. I question some of the science involved. But I'm not an expert in any of those, so I wouldn't know. But it's a cute romp. I kind of did it on a lark, on a whim, as a sort of goofy, semi-ironic wrap up to the long sequence of powered armor tales throughout the last century or so
that I did in the preceding months. Um, so that's basically all Mecha Mondays wound up being this entire year, if we're real, other than reading through the original, Mobile Suit Gundam novelization. I do have plenty of other mecha literature to get through. I know somebody told me that the Zeta Gundam, the Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam novelization has either mostly been or completely been translated at this point. So I've got to look into that and give that a read. I've been meaning to do that all year and just haven't gotten around to it because I'm lazy or something. It's been a busy year. Next week, I'm not totally sure what we'll do. I am leaning towards doing a read through of at least the first collection of Full Metal Panic. I want to say it's 3 or 4 light novels in one volume, and we'd bang through those. Um, that one goes pretty quickly. We won't be done that by the end of the year, but whatever. Um, let's see. I could start volume 2 or series 2 of season 3 rather of Mecha Mondays to do that, but I don't know. I figure I'll just do that every year, even if it's in the middle of a book. That'll be fine. Um, it's not ideal, but it'll work. So with that, I guess we'll call it. Hopefully people enjoyed. It's anachronisms. Sorry, anarchisms is very different. It's anachronisms aside, and the general tone and tenor. It's not the Lance isn't necessarily the most likable character in the world. He's not the least likable protagonist I've ever had in a book. Geez, what was that one called? I don't know if I still have that book. That one was baffling because it's like, oh, here's a guy who's self-destructive. Not so much self-destructive, but like everything he does is antithetical to him getting something done. And the way it's written does not make it seem like the author realizes this because he keeps getting, like, the plot just works out in his favor a bunch of times. It wasn't Tyrannosaur Canyon. Ugh, I cannot remember. It wasn't the Judas strain either. I don't remember what it was called. Anyway, um, I'll see if I can find that one and reread it. It was kind of trashy. It was Lazarus something. It wasn't the Lazarus Effect. It was one of those biblical names. I don't remember. Doesn't matter. Anyway, it was not very good. It had a protagonist who was just like always aggro violence all the time, and it was like, okay, buddy, calm down, calm down, buddy, friend, pal. And it's kind of making everybody's lives miserable, but acting like it's okay. Very strange. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Don't worry about that. But Lance is a character. He goes through some personal growth, so it's nice. Some. So yeah, next Monday we'll probably start Full Metal Panic. This Wednesday we'll continue reading through Permutation City by Greg Egan. The 25th I'll do a Christmas because it's Christmas. I'll do a Christmas stream. I'll do a short story there. It probably won't be a terribly long stream. Because at that point, I think, actually, I'm going to probably have to deal with stuff on Monday, too. We'll see what happens on the 23rd. That week is going to be kind of nutty, but I will try to do at least short streams throughout. And this Friday, we will be starting The Dark Forest by Xixin Liu. As I've made abundantly clear, I am not an expert in Chinese name pronunciations, so any corrections people can give me, please do. Do not hesitate. For instance, I did not know that Ye Wenjie had a silent J. So it was Ye Wenjie, which is wrong. So it was different. Thank you to whoever told me that. It also means I've probably been pronouncing Guo. What would that be? Guo um, from Legend of the Condor Heroes. I will read more of those as well at some point. I will read more of the Legend of the Condor Heroes series because there's 4 books, I think. I think it's 4 books in total. And we have read through the first one, and things kind of only get crazier from there. And the first one's pretty wild. They're all really quite good. I don't know which I'd say is my favorite. Probably one of the first 2. Um, Either one of those is probably my favorite, but they're all really good. Or at least entertaining. It's like reading reading a kung fu movie. It's great. It's a lot of fun. If you enjoy that sort of thing, which I do, I do. I enjoy them. They give me the giggles. Some are far better than others, but still, good times. After we get through Permutation City, we will probably be doing Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer because it is much requested, and it's quite a book. It is quite a book. Uh, Hopefully people will enjoy that. Hopefully I will too. Anyway, with that, I'm going to dip. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you're wondering why my performance is so rough and unedited, it's because I perform these live in front of a studio audience. Gosh, I wish. Um, Actually, that'd be too much pressure. Uh, I perform these live on the internet every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noonish Eastern Standard Time, or East Coast US time, or UTC minus 5 or 6. One of those two. Embarrassing that I can't remember that right off the top of my head. Anyway, I do them live. So if you want to tune in live, you can. Throw comments my way, chat, what have you. Um, Otherwise, feel free to watch these after the fact. Have fun. I don't really have any social networking things that I do. I'm hoping for next year, early next year, I'll get like a Discord server set up so that people can actually communicate with me or chat amongst thyself when I'm not around. Um, but otherwise, and also it'll make it easier for me to distribute recordings of these if people want them. I do not make money off of these. I do not need to make money off of these. I'm already gainfully employed. People have already said, hey, do you have something I can donate to? And I don't. I can set one up, probably. People can throw me money if they really want to. I don't know why you would, but supporting the arts? Question mark. I haven't had an issue with marking all these as educational. That it's I always I like look at the fact that I've done that. I'm like, maybe you shouldn't do that, but it's like the best category that fits, in my opinion, because they're books. It's literature, right? It's not high literature necessarily. Oh, he said, we'll get there. You want high literature, geez Louise. I mean, heck, Peter Watts has been Blindside, I think, has been made reading for certain like certain classes. There were some school kerfuffles I remember he had with Blindsight where a teacher was like, "Hey, um, I've read this book, I love it, and I've assigned it as reading for these kids in this science class that I'm teaching, or something, or psychology. I can't remember now. Um, but a bunch of parents caught wind that there were a lot of curse words in your book. Um, can I using your because Peter Watts released that for on as a what is it fair use Creative Commons license. It's under a Creative Commons license. You can read it right on his website or download a PDF if you wish. And so the teacher was like, "Oh, can I edit this and present them with a version that has the curse words removed?" And he was like, "Please don't." And then the teacher was like, "Understood, I won't. I'll find some other book to do." So he has occasionally run into hot water. Um, anyway, at least they asked his permission. I didn't even do that when I read them aloud. So if at any time he wants to tell me I've done wrong, well, he'd find it difficult to find an avenue. The closest would be when an audiobook company
put a damper on the first installment of Echopraxia, because that was one I had to re-upload. I don't think they can take down the live ones for some reason. I don't know why that would be. I would think they would. I don't know enough how. I do not know enough about how YouTube has that sort of thing organized. At any rate, I had to take all of Echopraxia down, much to my chagrin, except for the short story, The Colonel, which I left up there. That's one I would disseminate to people if they wanted it. It's not an issue to me. I don't care. Just, like, don't make money off it that I'm not getting, I guess. Anyway, I'm going to call it there. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. See you all next time. Toodaloo.